What is up, my fellow alphas? This is Podcast Unflooded. Ow! Today, this is the podcast where we teach you how to be an alpha male, a shrigma male. All you have to do is pay $100 a month to access our exclusive Discord where we are barely active and basically tell you basic things, such as maybe you should clean your room or just work out a little bit or, get good. In all seriousness, though, folks, this is Podcast Unflooded, the Wind Waker Unflooded Channel's podcast, where we talk about Zelda, world building, whatever courts our desires on a weekly basis.
Absolutely. That was a great intro. Welcome all. I am Joe Kendrick. I am joined by my friend Alexander Lathem. This is Podcast Unflooded. That's awesome. And we are alpha males. And if you're a subscriber, I don't care if you're a girl. You will become an alpha male no matter what. I don't care what's in your pants. You're an alpha male now. Welcome.
You have become masculinized with our masculinization ray. Forgive us for what we are about to do. But yeah, very excited about this episode today. You might notice, longtime fans might notice that my cameras maybe looking a little weird, the lighting. I'm not sure what's going on. It does look like I just hotboxed my room. And I assure you that is not the case. I would never abuse substances. I love them too much. Joe, what is today's topic? Do you remember?
I do remember. So Alex and I were talking about potential topics. We've gotten a little bit of support from the community. Thank you all for the comments that we've received. I'll go ahead and say, I've loved y'all's input on the channel, and I continue to ask for your support here. I want to know what you have to say, so comment down below your ideas for the podcast, any topics you want to see us cover, any questions you have, because that makes a difference, and that informs our content. We are here for you. And so any ideas that you have about discussions that you want to see, any questions that you have, that directly helps us pick the topic for today's episode. But Alex and I were talking, and we've decided that we want to kind of have a discussion on fantasy tropes, stuff that's led to the creation of the Zelda franchise, stuff that we're pulling from our own writing, things that inspire us about some of our favorite media. I mean, I don't know. I think it's time to give the floor over to Alex, and I guess I'm curious as to what are some things you've been thinking about, some questions that you have, and I'm curious about, I guess, I'm curious about how that especially affects your writing. We're both writers, and I don't know, maybe we can dig into that soon.
Fantasy is really fascinating because I do think so much fantasy, particularly in the United States and I guess maybe even Europe, is so Tolkien-based, right? And obviously Tolkien takes inspiration from the various mythologies of his time, especially English and Nordic mythology for sure. I mean, all those dwarven names in Lord of the Rings are kind of ripped straight out of the I think it's the Poetic Edda that has those dwarven names. I don't know. We don't have a lot of resources, sadly. But yeah, and that obviously Tolkien has inspired so much. And those mythologies have inspired so much. I think Dungeons and Dragons is so heavily inspired by Tolkien's work, and it's so hard to imagine the sort of, I said, the American, European, Western fantasy genre without that. And I think Zelda is interesting because I do think it stands on its own in a lot of ways, but I think it also really borrows from the hero's journey. So much of what I see in Link's characters kind of reminds me of the hero's journey, right? The old man, right? The leaving the familiar world and fighting the evil, being changed, and I think Wind Waker especially makes me think of that. And yeah, I know you asked me about my writing and how I feel affected by that, and it's interesting because I guess just I've tried many times to write fantasy stories and fantasy worlds, and even though it's one of my favorite genres, right, top 3 maybe, I've struggled to write a fantasy world or story, and I think it's partly because of the desire to want to do something so different that kind of breaks from the mold, but something that doesn't feel so, I guess, unfamiliar and so hard to grasp. And I think honestly, I think the fantasy that the writing that the works that have inspired my writing, in terms of fantasy have really just been I think the Elder Scrolls series, actually. I think that's a really great example of a fantasy genre that feels like it is doing so much unique and new. That, like, of course, I'm sure there is some Tolkien inspiration, right? Like, you have dwarves and elves, obviously, even though those come from, like, Nordic and other European folklore. But they've done such such interesting takes on these tropes that I find really fascinating. And I feel like I've talked for a little bit, so I kind of want to flip the question back on Joe. And Joe, you can ask me that same question again, because I don't think I answered your question really. But I want to know about, like, your writing in particular, because I think you have a lot more of that for people to see. And I'm curious how Zelda or fantasy has inspired your work.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I mean, there's a whole video I could do about like how Zelda has inspired my work in general as a writer, as a musician, artistically, graphically. I mean, there's so many things that that definitely it's hard to it'd be hard to summarize that in a short point. But yeah, like you said, I think Zelda has always been interesting to me because its take on a fantasy world is it's clearly there are things about it that are inspired by Tolkien. Like Zelda was created in the 80s. My understanding is that like that was very much kind of in the wake of, there was some Tolkien I think was gaining popularity then. Dungeons and Dragons was getting popular. We had the Tolkien cartoons, The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings movies had come out, and the Return of the King cartoons had come out. So I think that there was a zeitgeist there. Disney was experimenting with fantasy in a new way. You saw stuff with like the Black Cauldron, and there were these kinds of experiments where like I think that's a whole another interesting discussion that like because Disney's basis is in fairy tales, and it was turning to fantasy for a second, and into the 90s we get Quest for Camelot, and I think that was a really interesting kind of thing that is kind of maybe still dictating their path with stuff like Frozen. That's a whole different discussion. Disney and its fantasy genre, that's a whole different discussion. But yeah, no, I think Zelda's always been inspiring though because of that, because like it takes cues from that, is culturally created in the wake of that. But as the series continued, really found its own footing, and I don't know, like that took time, and that took like, I mean, there were several things in that first game that were fully formed, but I think a lot of the aesthetic, the fantasy aesthetic of Zelda, came from when it went 3D with Ocarina of Time, and I think it's interesting that like it takes that iteration, and I guess like that inspires me that like, sometimes it takes time to iterate and flesh things out. And I guess I appreciate that Zelda has been transparent as a series where we can see that creative evolution. But I don't know, this is a long answer. You asked me a lot of questions, but also I guess like within my own writing to go ahead and get into that as well. Yeah, I've done like sci-fi projects like Star Boys that have fantasy elements. I've done Tin Man that has sci-fi fantasy elements about and a lot of those are like robot based. And I don't know, something that's I guess encouraging to me about the way Zelda handles fantasy is that anything's on the table, and Tears of the Kingdom can come out, and robots are back on the table in a new way, vehicles are back on the table in a new way. So you have this Tolkien medieval fantasy inspired by King Arthur and Merlin, but you also have sci-fi robots are also a part of that world. And I guess like I appreciate that, like, I think what Zelda has taught me is that as long as you're creatively inspired, you can do anything in your fantasy world. And, as long as there's motivation behind it. So I don't know, that's something that really inspires me within my work. And I don't know, I really believe that I love Tolkien fantasy, but to me it's like fantasy is more exciting when you push the bounds of that genre. It's fantasy, it can be whatever you want. Don't limit yourself.
Mm-hmm. For sure. I mean, I think, and that's what I appreciate that about Zelda too as well, because I think you, like you said, there's kind of you see like sort of an evolution and playing around with ideas, and like the Zora originally are like these kind of just another set of enemies, and then kind of now get to become their own culture and civilization that have a relationship with Hylians and other groups. And I think Zelda has like really interesting, the Gerudo and Goron and Zora to me are like very unique fantasy creatures. And like, once again, I'm operating from my own bias of like consuming a lot of media from my own sphere of influence, right? From United States and in Europe. And I don't know, I honestly couldn't tell you if like Gorons and Gerudos and stuff are based off of some sort of Japanese folklore or some other super Japanese like fantasy, series that came out before Zelda. I think it's entirely possible. but it's something that I think feels very unique. And I think that's why Zelda maybe stands out so much, is you're getting this kind of different perspective from another part of the world, but also there's like a cultural exchange going on, right? Like you mentioned, I think it's, very clear like early Zelda was inspired by that kind of 80s fantasy that was going on in the United States, that revival of like, oh, Tolkien's like kind of getting popular, and you have these Rankin Bass and Ralph Bakshi films, and there's Dungeons and Dragons, and like fantasy is like maybe more popular than it ever was. It's huge. And it kind of reminds me of how like I think so many American comics, right, were taking inspiration from like Japanese manga, right, and stuff like that. So like I said, there's this really cool cultural exchange. And I can definitely see, I will say, like you mentioned Zelda being like inspiration for your music, and I definitely really do see that. Like there's parts of, I've listened to so many of your tracks, and I think like, dang, I could see this being in some like fantasy Zelda game. Like I really could. So I definitely see that. And I think for me personally, what Zelda kind of inspires me, what inspires in my own work and what I want to create is like, I really do like the idea of cycles and like the cyclical nature of things that Zelda plays around with, and sort of the even just like the variations of Hyrule. The idea that Hyrule is changing constantly. Maybe there's different versions of it, and I think even stuff they kind of touch upon maybe a little bit briefly, but like I really did like Link Between Worlds and the Low Rule, right? In this sort of like alternate version of Hyrule. Like that's really fascinating, and there's just stuff like that they occasionally touch on that I'm like, oh, that's intriguing. And they're not the only ones to do it, but it does get my wheels turning sometimes, and I'll think on it when I'm trying to come up with a fantasy or even just any story concept.
Yeah, and I know that, like, kind of touching upon what we talked about in the Apocalypse episode as well, right? I mean, something that I see as a theme in your work is especially government cycles, right? Cycles of revolution and oppression to revolution. I feel like that's something I've seen tackled in your work, and, society cycles in a society and their reaction to their government. I don't know, I'd be curious to hear you talk about that too, because I've seen it in like the Fallen Star story, of course. I think about Lost Men that you've written, and I don't know, I'm curious about like your perspective on, not just like from an apocalyptic setting, but from that idea of cycles.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up, because it is something I think I do write a lot about. And I guess just like I've never really prescribed to like great man theory, the idea that like history is motivated by like individuals making like, a few individuals making decisions that society kind of rolls along with. I think it is very much a collective force, like humanity. We're all kind of pulling on these directions. And I've always been really fascinated on, and I think it's just kind of studying like sociology and learning about like intersectionality and just kind of the way things are connected in our society, wealth and poverty and race and all these things that just sort of like are intertwined, and you almost can't talk about one subject without talking about the other. And so I've always been kind of thinking about just political movements, especially learning about political movements in America, the rise of like the anti-slavery and the sort of abolitionist movement in the United States leading to a civil war, and sort of the fallout of that, and sort of the, I think about like, oh, the Reconstruction in the South was sort of not super heavy-handed, and you see, for instance, like the planter aristocracy kind of get to keep their power, and how that like basically prolongs the suffering of individuals in the South, especially Black people, and I just like I'm fascinated by that, and the idea of things, like if we had done a harsher Reconstruction and done the 40 acres and a mule, how would that affect things? I think it's just because I live in the South, right? And I see and learn about the history of Jim Crow and segregation. And just when you kind of get to I guess when you're older and you get a chance to learn about how a lot of that just really worked, right? It's hard not to think about like these systems and how they affect us, and how we collectively work towards making the world either a better or worse place. And that was kind of a ramble, but yeah, I'm interested in political movements and people. And I use like the South and sort of the Civil War and abolitionism and Jim Crow and these kind of things as examples because I live near the results of them. I live in a world that had these systems, and how have they evolved? How have they been dissolved, if at all? And I think it's just fascinating stuff. And I think it's just like, I admit that in my own writing, as much as I like having engaging characters, I also like having engaging big ideas, I guess, about, the world itself, which is a huge, bold statement, but it fascinates me.
Really great answer, and I guess I love what you touch on there. That's like, when you talk and you're writing and all that stuff is influencing you, the history of the South, and there's this perspective that you have on the world and the issues with it, and you're not approaching it from any kind of agenda. It's because this is your heritage. This is the world that you grew up in, and there are things that you have seen, and of course that's going to motivate your perspective, and that's going to motivate the kinds of stories that you want to tell and the kind of things that you want people to learn from history. I don't know. I really like that answer, and I guess this does lead me to my next question. I have a question for you, Alex. I'm curious to know what you think, and I think we've talked before in our own conversations about, in this discussion of fantasy tropes, there's a way that sometimes Tolkien-inspired fantasy, I think sometimes it's the way that they tackle races can be a little problematic, and the way that they ascribe, there's that really outdated, like, bad idea, right, of genetic differences between races. But fantasy stories sometimes, they sometimes sit on that a little too much and want to say, oh, well, maybe the orcs that's the evil race. Those are the bad guys. Maybe the dwarves are just naturally greedy. And I guess I'm curious to know your take on that, because I feel like Zelda usually does a better job of that. But like fantasy tropes and these stories about different races that, have heightened differences, but also how do you tell stories about that? Because there are cultural differences, but there shouldn't be these genetic differences. And I feel like this is, dangerous ground to tread. That, like, I don't, these ideas that you promote, like, these things matter, the way that you tell these stories and what you present to your audience. I don't know. I'm curious to know your take on that, especially in fantasy tropes.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely like a complicated question. And, I when you were asking me that question, I couldn't help but think about like how I believe, Tolkien, after writing The Hobbit, some people, and I think, some Jewish people were kind of like, yeah, I feel like these dwarves feel a little bit like anti-Semitic caricatures, these big-nosed, short, greedy little guys. And it's something that, like, Tolkien, I believe, took to heart. And I think you can read in his letters, he was like, yeah, ooh, like, I didn't mean to do that. And I think you have these, he even, like, rewrote bits of it to kind of counter that. And I think that's the thing, because a lot of times fantasy races sometimes just feel like, they don't feel like separate races. They feel like kind of just different human races, right? Like, what is so different about elven society? Is it, it sometimes seems like they're just kind of stuck up individuals, and we know plenty of stuck up humans. And yeah, I think there can be kind of issues with that. Like, I think about, like in Elder Scrolls, a franchise I love, the orcs are one of the few peoples that are like very nomadic and kind of have like a tribal kind of aesthetic and identity. And they're also perceived to be like incredibly violent, right? And I know some people are going to be like, well, in the lore, it's an evil god that makes the orcs. And it's like, well, yeah, but like we wrote the lore, like the person writing it. And I don't think there was any malicious intent, but it is something you kind of want to like, I've seen, fantasy writers fall into that thing where it's like, I'm going to make these groups, these fantasy races savage, and they seem to borrow, based on like maybe like indigenous peoples, right? And it feels a little weird. And there's of course like the dwarven like greediness and sort of like, I don't know, but it's like it's very complicated because, for instance, I think like the big noses of dwarves, and even I think in trolls and ogres and stuff in like a lot of that Nordic mythology kind of predates, I think even just like Judaism in Europe, or maybe even Judaism overall. And so it's like, it is kind of feels like a little bit of like a minefield. but I think there can be a danger, and I kind of almost like how Zelda handles it a little bit with like the bokoblins and moblins, just because they do feel more like just like animals to me. Um, but then again, I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if I'm like committing war crimes against a group of people as I drop my, Zora, or not Zora, but what's the race from Tears of the Kingdom, the ancient one, right?
Oh, the Zonai.
Zonai, yeah, that's a Z word. I feel like my Zonai atomic bomb. Sometimes I drop it on, a goblin camp, and I'm like, maybe I'm the bad guy.
Right.
Um,
No, I think
and I
that's a
think it
really
just
interesting
requires
point.
clever writing at the end of the day. I think it's. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Joe, but yeah, I guess just like it's something. Just I think it's worth being aware of, and saying, you know, I want to be careful with this because it's never, like I said, I don't think a lot of times it's malicious. I think it just kind of happens sometimes. And there's no big deal when it happens. It's just about, as Tolkien did, just living and learning.
No, I totally agree, right? And I think that's I like what you touch on there because there's when it comes to like bokoblins and moblins, right? And like I don't think there's anything wrong with telling a story about slaying beasts. Like I think part of the human experience is that sometimes you'll have a peaceful society and oh no, there's a wild animal that gets into the camp, and sometimes you have to slay that beast. And Zelda has heightened these beasts to be, they have armies, they can be bosses, they can, they can be imp-like creatures like bokoblins and moblins. And I think there's a reason that they're drawn more like pigs. But it also gets complicated, right? Because right, like as soon as you start giving them personage, which usually Zelda doesn't do, but like yeah, what's gonna happen when you get to that line? And I think about that episode from the Zelda TV series from the '80s, right? The Moblins Revolt. If you remember that one, where the Moblins, like, I mean, they have dialogue throughout the whole show. The Moblins, they're talking to like they have that little voice, and then one day they decide, you know what, we're gonna break free from Ganon. We're gonna be our own people, and it's like yeah, how do you approach those ideas matter. And it's okay to have differences between tribes. There are cultural differences, and it's okay to show those. Diversity, like it's okay to have diversity in your world. But right, like when you start creating differences in personage, in humanity, that definitely starts to get scary. And I think like you said, these ideas do matter.
For sure. Yeah. And I guess just to reiterate what I said, like, and what we've been saying is just, it can be kind of a tough thing to write about, but it's not anything to be, I encourage people to try and write about it. Because like you said, like, you know, I'm not necessarily against maybe saying, oh, here's an evil fantasy race, right? Um, but it is something just like, we all draw from our experiences and from what we hear and see in the world, whether that's something we hear and see willingly or not. And it can definitely like, permeate, I guess, in our work. But it's always like a really fun challenge, I think, to try and say like, oh, let me do a new take on orcs that isn't just like they're a violent, like race of beings that are just like, degenerated elves, right? And I think even in like the Elder Scrolls, like, world that I mentioned, like I think they do still a pretty good job at like showing, different types of orcs. I think even in the game Skyrim, you see like a famous orc chef and like an orc bard and just like very normal, nice dudes like that. I think it's like refreshing when I see these kinds of orcs. Like I love a good like tough orc barbarian, but I also just like a chill dude, and there's just so much you can do with it and the fantasy genre. And like you said, I think pushing it in a lot of directions. And I guess just like if anyone ever is wanting advice for how to make like unique fantasy creations or races or species or whatever, I do encourage to not just look at Tolkien or anything, but look at like what he was inspired by, and feel free to workshop it and feel free to say, oh, well, I've looked at like dwarves in Norse mythology, and I think I'm going to have them be like 95% different than what I read. It's still worth reading about, right? But it can help you make a decision. And I just want to encourage people to keep trying to write and create unique fantasy stuff because, like I said, it's one of my favorite genres.
I totally agree, and I guess I really love that message because I totally agree with that. But it's like also like as a result of what you're saying, it's like good writing is not just about good writing; it's about good research, and it's also about nuance. And whenever you can add nuance, it never hurts to think about that stuff, right? And to be thinking about it, and it's not just about being creative, but it is about thinking about things. I don't know. I think it's better when you think through things. So I don't know. To me, good writing is intentful, but maybe that's a whole nother podcast discussion about writing. And I don't know. Maybe I don't want to sound too pretentious, but
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I never want to come across. I'm just a human being, as is Joe, I think, but it could be artificially generated. But I'm sorry, Joe. Yeah, I think research, like you said, is a great point. I don't want to make the podcast episode run too long, but I have a lot of fun researching and like looking into things, and I think you know, I think it's not necessarily bad to say like, oh, I want my dwarves to be inspired by this like human culture or subculture. I think that's not bad at all. I think it is just like about researching it and doing it in a way that is not derogatory, I guess. Um, and I dig that shit. So just keep up the good work, creators and fantasy writers. I love the genre.
I totally agree. I do think that's all the time we have for today. Like you said, we don't want it to run too long. Thank you all so much for watching. Comment down below any experience that you have. I'm sure there are writers in our audience, and I'd love to hear from you about how do you tackle fantasy stories. And I know there's a lot of people that are interested in Zelda, that do Zelda theories. And so how do all these ideas impact the way that you read the material, right? The way that you see the Zelda franchise. Comment down below the way you see, how you think the world of Zelda handles these tropes. I'd love to hear from you.
Yes. Tell us your experiences. Ask us your questions. And thank you so much for watching and listening. We really do appreciate it. We have a lot of fun recording these, and it's a great little like content buffer in between our normal videos.
I totally agree. I have nothing more to say, so I'm gonna stop the recording.
Ow.